Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the launch of Fraudscape 2025. I'm Simon Miller. I'm Director of Policy Communications and Strategy here at CIFAS, the UK's leading fraud prevention service. Fraudscape is our most important data release of the year, and it has fast become one of the most important data releases in relation to fraud risk and fraud-related data in the UK. I'm going to say a few words about how this session will run today before I hand over to Mike Haley, our CEO, who's going to give a personal perspective and view both on Fraudscape data itself, but also the wider uh, fraud landscape. So today's session is going to run for about 50 minutes. You will hear from Mike, and then we will go to Stephen Dalton, our Director of Intelligence, who's going to talk to the detail of the report. We're going to broaden that discussion out to look at the policy implications and regulatory considerations around some of the key data points, as well as any surprises in that data set with our Director of Public Policy, Helena Wood. After that, we're going to move to a short Q&A, and questions will be open to the floor. In terms of the handling of this, please note that we have journalists in the room, so anything that you say will be on record. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll aggregate those and bring them to light later in this afternoon's session. It falls on me just to say thank you to all for making the time to be here this afternoon, and thank you especially to the team and particularly to Scott Reeve for pulling this together. So without further ado, Mike Haley, CEO of CIFAS.
Well, thank you, Simon. And can I reiterate a welcome and thank you for attending the launch webinar for this year's edition of Fraudscape. If you haven't yet accessed or read the report, you can find it in the link provided in the chat. You will be hearing later again from Simon Miller, our Director of Policy, Strategy and Communications, Helena Wood, our Director of Public Policy, and Stephen Dalton, our Director of Intelligence. And today, this panel will dive into the key statistics from this year's report. They will also discuss and debate the wider themes from this year's report, what they mean for our efforts to tackle fraud and fraudsters and to protect victims. And we're also keen to engage with you in this conversation. So please make sure that you ask your questions using the questions functionality in Zoom. But first, I'd like to take a moment just to set the scene. Our annual Fraudscape report provides a detailed overview and analysis of the fraud risk data filed by our members to our fraud risk databases, the National Fraud Database and the Insider Threat Database. And it's that data over the 12 months to December 2024 that gives us a real picture of what's going on in fraud against our members. So we're going to be presenting these analysis of what's on the fraud databases, but alongside other intelligence that have been provided by CIFAS members, our partners, and law enforcement. And it's together that this data sets and intelligence creates insight, which creates a compelling account of the challenges and threats facing the fraud prevention community, as well as pointing out the emerging threat vectors, which will require focus and dedication in the next 12 months to address. Now, Fraudscape has become one of UK's key fraud data releases. It influences policy and shapes the response to industry and fraud strategies by our members. Now, the headlines make for grim reading. We had a record number of cases filed to the National Fraud Database in 2024. This follows a 9% decrease on filings in the year before. And I think that was shown in other fraud indices where fraud seemed to have taken a step back across the country. But this year we've seen fraud bounce back, and overall there's an actual 5% increase, and the largest number ever of fraud cases that have been filed to the database. Now, our intelligence shows that a key driver for these rises is a rapid technological change and the easy availability of AI services and fraud toolkits, known as fraud as a service. But also, we've seen geopolitical uncertainty and continued pressures on the cost of living, providing the opportunity and the motivation for first-party criminals to exploit. So these issues have an impact on the data filed by organizations to the National Fraud Database. These same circumstances may also provide incentive for those who may be struggling financially to commit fraud to bolster incomes. The data that you're going to hear about, the Fraudscape data, demonstrates the extent to which fraud is not only just industrialized, but digitized. The services that enable us to stay connected also expose us to criminals. Fully 80% of all scams are now digitally enabled, with fraudsters moving with ease between platforms, services, and technologies. And we know that the threat from fraud is also global and organized, with criminal gangs now mimicking the size and structures of corporations. AI is also transforming the capability of fraudsters to operate at scale, harvesting data quickly on targets, producing near perfect fake documents in seconds, enabling attacks on networks at an entirely new scale. And through the use of deepfakes and AI generated images and voices, impersonating people, both consumers and authority figures and businesses, to steal their data and their savings. This has made the threat from fraud not only more compelling but difficult to detect, but also has made it more urgent. However, I want to end on a more positive note. I believe that we are turning on the tide on fraud through building a fraud fighting community that is global in scope. CIFAS alone helped its members prevent over 2.1 billion last year in fraud losses. That's 2.1 billion that otherwise would have gone into the hands of criminals. But we know that there is still so much more to do. But it's only through working together, specifically through the sharing of data and intelligence, that we will beat the criminals. And CIFAS exists for that very purpose. So this year's Fraudscape report makes clear that progress that is being made, but also the scale of the challenge. So with that, I'd like to introduce Stephen Dorton to give us an overview of the key information from this year's report. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. As Mike said, Fraudscape is a combination of the detailed analysis of cases filed by members to the National Fraud Database, or NFD, the Insider Threat Database, as well as intelligence gathered by the CIFAS intelligence team throughout the year through meetings with members, law enforcement, and with other partners. The NFD is the most comprehensive database of fraud risk data and intelligence in the UK. There are nearly 2 million records in the system, and this data intelligence is shared in real time and is online 24/7 days a week. The NFD holds records of first and third party fraud risk, identity fraud, facility or account takeover, false insurance claims, false applications, asset conversion, and misuse of facility, which also covers money muling. So if we move on to the next slide. As Mike said, it's been a record-breaking year. In 2024, over 421,000 cases were filed to the NFD. That's a rise of 5% on the previous high in 2022. It's also the largest annual increase in filings ever recorded by CIFAS, over 46,000 additional cases. CIFAS members recorded a case to the NFD every 2 minutes, with identity fraud again being the most commonly reported fraud risk type, accounting for 59% of all filings. The second most reported case type was facility or account takeover. This was one of the drivers behind the overall rise in cases, recording an unprecedented 76% increase in filings with fraudulent activity, particularly against telcos and the online retail sector. This increase reflects reporting on a scale this increase reflects reporting on the scale of UK fraud elsewhere. The Crime Survey of England and Wales has reported a 19% rise in fraud incidents year ending September 24, and the Global Anti-Scams Alliance estimated that individuals in the UK lost £11.4 billion to scams, up £4 billion on the previous year. So if we move on and look at ID fraud, identity fraud is still the most commonly reported fraud risk type, representing 59% of the cases filed. It was previously 64%. The majority of cases concerned fraud committed through online channels. This is consistent with previous years and highlights the scale by which victims are impersonated using online platforms, and is reflecting the ongoing shift towards digital applications for products and services. The increase in identity fraud cases is predominantly linked to impersonations, targeting the telco sector, up 73%, where criminals are seeking to acquire mobile handsets by stealing identities to create accounts and order mobiles. We also have seen an uplift in facility takeover fraud to acquire handsets from existing account holders, which I'll talk about later. Other products targeted in the identity fraud category include personal store cards, which are up 35%, personal bank accounts up 12%, personal credit cards up 8%, and motor insurance also up 8%. Collectively, these products account for 63% of identity fraud cases, highlighting a growing threat in these sectors. This threat is further amplified by the growing availability, as Mike alluded to, of generative AI technologies, giving criminals and increasingly novice actors a platform to compromise victims' identities and commit fraud in higher and higher volumes and with a greater likelihood of success. And as in 2023, we continue to see the greatest number of victims are in the older age brackets, with 61-year-olds being the most 61-year-olds and above being the most common victims. So moving on to look at facility or account takeover, there were 74,000 cases of facility takeover filed in 2024. That's an increase of 76% on the previous year. Now, this increase is actually consistent with external research analysis, which suggests that account takeover is becoming one of the fastest growing forms of online attack, where there is an increased use of malware and automated attacks that are able to target high volumes of accounts. As previously referenced, there's a healthy appetite for the latest mobile phone technology, with almost half of all account takeovers related to mobile phone accounts. That's 48%, with filings rising by 105%. Most filings relate to the acquisition of handsets by criminals posing as mobile network operators, offering attractive upgrades. This activity involves the use of mule addresses who receive the redirected handsets. We know this activity is sophisticated, it's highly organised, and it's occurring across the UK, but also has international dimensions to it as well. There's also been a surge in filings of unauthorised SIM swaps by nearly 3,000 cases compared to 2023, which were in the hundreds. This increase is partly a reflection of changes in filing behaviour, but it is potentially reflecting the true scale of the problem. It's consistent with reporting to Action Fraud, which has showed a doubling of reports year on year since 2022. SIM swapping is becoming extremely attractive to threat actors as mobiles are increasingly used, as it allows them to bypass many of the security controls. Second highest proportion of filings to account takeover relates to online retail sector, which has increased by 75%. Most cases relate to unauthorised security or personnel changes, which has increased by 47%. Threat actors employ various methods such as credential stuffing, brute force attacks, and malware to breach accounts and steal sensitive data, which can then be used to obtain high-value goods. Analysis also suggests the increasing use of tactics to redirect fraudulent obtained goods to alternative addresses or collection sites as well. So moving on to misuse of facility. This was previously second in terms of volume, but it's now been edged out by 9 cases by account takeover. So compared to 2023, filing has remained steady overall with a small rise of 1%. Now, misuse of facility includes abuse of financial services and products such as evasion of payment and encashment fraud, as well as filing reasons that are indicative of money muling. Now, there's been an increase in filing around evasion of payment, especially in relation to personal loans, with organisations continuing to report applications submitted for loans, assets and credit cards where there is no clear intention of payment. Now, this represents roughly half of the filings in this category. The other half of filing reasons we attribute to money muling, and there were 34,000 cases linked to money muling in 2024. Now, this is a reduction of 8% overall. On the filings that we did receive, it's most often occurring in personal current accounts that are being used, but this is also down in 2023, but we're seeing an increasing use of company accounts being used. Filings in relation to those rose by 4,500 cases and now account for 1 in 5 of all suspected mule cases filed to the NFD. And the reasons for this overall reduction in money muling are unclear, because intelligence suggests members continue to reference significant volumes and increases in money mule cases, with many defining money muling as an ever-expanding issue with no respite. No doubt that's a question we can explore perhaps a bit later on. So moving on to false applications, although one of our smaller filing categories, false applications, saw an increase of 10% overall in 2024, with 21,700 cases filed. Along with misuse of facility, this is a first-party fraud risk. And key increases were seen across bank accounts and insurance sectors, with 66% of these cases linked to either bank accounts or insurance-related products. Failure to disclose material information and false documentation were the largest reasons for filing it in banking at 82%. For example, uncleared CCJ saw an increase where there's clear attempts to conceal previous bad debt. An enduring enabler, though, is the seemingly legitimate websites that offer fake or joke in inverted commas documents, which can then be used to support false applications. And the increasing sophistication and volume of these, and where they're supported by AI, poses a real challenge, with improvements in those documents making some of them capable of bypassing verification checks. Members in multiple sectors have reported the same templates in circulation, where individuals are simply editing personal details and transactions. And finally, let's move on to insider threat. The insider threat database is the only database in the UK that records instances of dishonest conduct by applicants and employees in the workforce, such as bribery and corruption, theft of personal or commercial data, and customer account fraud, helping employers and recruiters identify potential threats to their organisation and to protect their workforce and shareholders and customers. The number of cases filed to this database is much smaller than the NFD, and in 2024 there were over 260 cases filed. The leading case sites were dishonest action by staff, followed by false employment applications, which accounted for 29%. The filing reasons are of abuse of company time account for 13% of dishonest transaction cases, which is up 9% on 2023, and is the second most dominant filing reason. Now, this increase could be linked to a rise in work avoidance behaviour or concerningly polygamous working, a term coined for individuals who work multiple roles. And there's an inference there that this economic uncertainty, as it continues, will tempt individuals into taking multiple jobs, particularly home-based roles, with similar remits and responsibilities to boost their income. The majority of dishonest action cases, though, were discovered through internal controls and audit functions, and that highlights the importance of those strong internal controls, fraud controls and training. So that completes the roundup. There's a summary coming up on screen now, but I'm more than happy to take some questions. Simon, back to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen, for that overview, and welcome, Helena. Now, I think we need to sort of broaden out the richness of the data that you have just shared and drill down into certain elements. And it's worth saying there's a lot of nuance behind each and every one of those figures, as well as also multiple stories of harm and loss. Let's just start with, within that rich theme of data, what are any surprises for you?
I think the consistency of increasing across all file types within the NFD, so every single fraud category saw an increase. Some were greater than others significantly. Obviously, CIFAS has a growing membership. We have over 800 members now on board, so you would expect there to be a consequential rise. But what's striking here is that most of the increases we're seeing are from existing members. And I guess the other call out is the significant increase in facility takeover. And this is largely driven by telcos filing around the acquisition by fraudsters of high-end mobile handsets.
Let's just pause on that for a minute, because that figure in relation to the facility takeover is particularly startling. Is there anything more that we can read into the detail?
Well, one inference is that fraudsters are finding this a much easier route. Clearly, a lot of effort is being taken by firms to defend themselves at the front door. There's a plethora of tools and technologies now available to support this work. And as financial products and services have become more remote and digitally enabled, this has created new opportunities for threat actors to attack organizations' existing customers. So there's an abundance of social media lures and phishing attacks designed to obtain personal data and break into people's accounts. And it may well be that a lot of threat actors are seeing that as an easier route than trying to set up entirely new identities to persuade members to let them in that way.
Thank you, Stephen. I don't think we can talk about fraud without mentioning AI, and you did touch upon this earlier. But what is there in the data that we can see? And it may be that there isn't much about the use of AI by the fraudsters.
Well, you're right that we can't see that any of our cases are AI enabled, although it seems highly likely that they will be. CIFAS is considering how it can start to capture that within the data that we get, so we can start to develop those for members. But the challenge, even if we had a recording device, would be how to spot them. These, by their very nature, are really difficult to spot. These fakes. There's a view that the large language models and the generative AI that is being most actively used in phishing attacks, or is assisting with the creation of fake profiles, professionally created websites, creating realistic profiles to entice their victims in. Obviously, the most well-known of these deepfakes are deepfakes of celebrities, supposedly offering endorsements on investments. But documents is also probably a critical enabler in the commission of many frauds, and I think that's where perhaps some of the biggest risks occur. It's in the way AI can be used to generate fake documents to support fraud attacks, and that's a growing issue. We've recently published a thematic assessment on AI and amplifying the risks of document fraud, and one of our contributors to that agency confirmed that in the last 12 months they've seen deep fake attempts to circumvent facial similarity and liveness checks every 5 minutes for a client. So it's a real and present danger.
Helena, let's bring you in. Your world is government. I'm really curious to know, and I'm sure our audience as well, is what you think the implications are for government and indeed for policy more generally of this year's Fraudscape data.
Well, they certainly land at an opportune time. Those people on the call today, which had the opportunity to join us at the GASA summit last week, will have heard from Lord Hanson, the UK's first fraud minister appointed just before Christmas, that we're going to have a new fraud strategy this year. We're hoping to see that sometime before Christmas. So these stats come just at the point where we're kicking off that process of consultation. And for me, the stats really bring out two really important things that need to be considered when comparing this to the previous fraud strategy. The first thing I would say, and perhaps controversially, is that I think the last fraud strategy from the previous government wasn't, in fact, a fraud strategy. It was, in fact, a consumer fraud strategy. And for me, it really underplayed the role of fraud against business and the implications and impacts on that. And again, if we look back in time, somewhat the last Labour government's mantra was very much education, education, education. And this Labour government's is prosperity, prosperity, prosperity. And for me, these stats show that you can't talk about prosperity and growth in the UK without talking about fraud. Each one of these cases is a fraud against one of our members, which, it reduces their ability to invest and grow. But aside from that, really reflects on the UK's reputation as a place to invest for the future. So I'm hoping to see from that next fraud strategy a much greater focus on fraud against business. We've already started to see the overtures on that from the government, and hopefully these stats will strengthen the case for having a much greater focus beyond consumer-based frauds, as important as they are, and that focus should continue. But they are not the only fraud in town. The second thing for me, and Stephen's mentioned this already, but the impact of identity fraud. And of course, that's something that we've been talking about for a long time at CIFAS. It's something that really impacts on our members, but it was hugely underplayed in the last fraud strategy. So in this fraud strategy, I'm hoping we look beyond the kind of headline figures behind identity fraud and really look at the impact. Whereas if one were to be cynical, one might suggest that the downplaying of identity fraud is because the financial loss is borne by business rather than consumers. But for me, it really underplays that wider impact on individuals, regardless of financial loss. It's a kind of psychological impact, huge amounts of its administrative burden on individuals to unravel those credit scores, the loans taken out in their name, not to say a kind of reduction in, that confidence in the digital economy, particularly of those in the older age bracket. So I think we really should see this as a kind of call to arms for a much greater response on identity fraud. going forward. But veering perhaps into some hyperbole, and we're going to mention AI a third time already within 20 minutes of this webinar, of course, because it's 2025, and that's the word we have to drop in every 5 minutes. But I really genuinely think that this is the use case for the criminals around AI, the ability to, as Stephen points out, face swap, evade onboarding controls, produce really high quality fake documents in a way we could not have even imagined even a year ago. That for me is the growth area for fraud, and it's going to accelerate. I would perhaps put money on in the next 3 to 5 years in a way we have hitherto not comprehended. And that not only is a fraud risk, for me, it's a financial stability risk because it's very much undermining the role of remote onboarding and digital onboarding in our financial services industry. And again, consumer confidence, and again, confidence in the UK as a financial centre. So I'm hoping we're going to see this much greater focus through a number of lenses on identity fraud.
Thank you so much. I'm going to come back to you now. And I will say we talk about AI, obviously, because AI is so pertinent to all of us, but identity fraud. This is your moment. What does government need to do to tackle this?
I'm going to start with a shameless plug, Simon, as ever, as you know, is my MO. But we did some work on this actually, published in December last year with our colleagues at the Royal United Services Institute, where we gathered a group of industry professionals from the digital ID space, the RegTech industry, financial services, the consumer industry, to look and pull apart this issue. What are the viable responses that the government needs to include in that fraud strategy? And you can find that online at rusi.org. Within that, we had 9 recommendations for policymakers. We don't have time to go through all of those today, but the 3 I would particularly pick out, which are hugely pertinent to that next fraud strategy, are, we do need to review the law in this area. It might surprise many outside the fraud prevention community joining us today that identity theft, that essential precursor to identity fraud, is not a criminal offence. Even though we're seeing this at scale, huge data breaches and data theft, the huge rise that Stephen points on phishing crime, it's not a criminal offence. And while practically that's not necessarily a problem for prosecutors who can use the Ways and Means Act, they'll use other legislation like the Computer Misuse Act to prosecute. I think for me, there's a framing problem around identity theft, and it's huge importance to this area. So we've just had the fraud review by Jonathan Fisher-Casey kick off just about this week, and we're hoping he will consider the role of identity theft within that as part of that fraud law review. The second part point to which I think is really concerning, and where the UK is definitely falling behind its peers, is around support for victims. And we know, I've pointed to previous comments around huge impact on victims that's been somewhat under the radar. There's very, very little help for victims of identity fraud. And if you look at our peers in the US, Australia, New Zealand and Canada, they all have a state-led or state-funded ID repair service. What's there for UK victims? There's a checklist that the police give you and away you go. I mean, I think we're really failing the victims of identity fraud in that regard. And I know we're not a cash-rich society right now, and budgets are incredibly tight. But I think this is one area with very little funding you could do a lot, and I would love to see some more work there. Third, of course, I'm going to say the word data sharing because it's a CIFAS webinar, and it's incumbent on us to always talk about data sharing. But, to tackle ID fraud, it goes without saying that data sharing is essential. So in that paper, we pointed to things like Operation Amber Hill. For those not familiar with it, this is the Metropolitan Police-led false and fraudulent obtained document repository that's shared with industry to help them spot at the front door fake documents being used to access credit lines, for example. That's been somewhat mothballed over the years, one might say, and the refunding and reimagining that in the age of kind of digital identities and kind of digital onboarding is really essential in that strategy, I'd say. But also, we also pointed in that paper to the need to allow industry to verify identities, the genuine identities, against government databases. And in the age of things like privacy enhancing technologies, that can't be impossible. I think we have to be quite ambitious in that regard when we look what's coming down the line and the difficulty our members will have in spotting non-genuine identity documents. So much more to be done there. But, in the round, I'm hoping and quite hopeful that we're going to see a lot more on identity fraud in the next UK fraud strategy later on this year.
So three very clear calls there and a plea as well. I'm
Yeah,
sure there'll be questions
absolutely.
about that. Stephen, we've talked about AI, we've talked about ID fraud. I think it'd be remiss not to talk some more about muling. The headline figure seems positive, but there's always nuance and complication in the detail. That is the question.
Yes, well, money muling appears to be down, so that's great news, isn't it? But that isn't doesn't seem to be a reflection of the reality in terms of activity. We've seen obviously lots of our other fraud categories going up. There's money being made by fraudsters. They need to exit out of the system somehow, and they're going to continue to use money mules for that purpose. So it does seem a bit odd. It does appear to be a little bit contrary. So if members are filing less, why might that be? Well, first of all, there is a high standard of proof required to file to CIFAS, and that's absolutely right. It should be. But members also need to consider now whether they're dealing with a complicit mule or somebody that's is non-complicit. We know sadly that some mules are being coerced or being blackmailed into performing this role. And it's really difficult for members to try and discern those that are saying that, because we also know from an intelligence perspective that there are many that actually aren't victims, but they're being coached to say that they are. So proving that they're one or the other is extremely challenging for members. So it may well be that a lot of members are erring on the side of caution.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And I'm going to bring you on this because I know this is an issue that interests regulators and that nary a day goes by when you're not in conversation with one of our regulators. Is there some more context you'd like to share on this?
Yes, I mean, we were interested to see the results of the FCA's review of firms' use of the National Fraud Database in the context of money muling, which was released in January this year. So if you've not read that, it makes for really interesting reading. And if I pick out some of the statistics from that, within the cohort reviewed by the FCA, they reviewed around 200,000 cases of off-boarded mules, and only a third of those were filed to the National Fraud Database. Now, Stephen's pointed to some of the reasons when you're looking strictly through the lens of money muling itself, why firms might be hesitant to file. But I think if we look out into kind of the broader regulatory landscape beyond even financial crime legislation, the regulation, the world in which we operate, there's a lot going on that has a sort of inhibiting and chilling factor on firms filing of money mules, for example. There's a massive increased focus on financial inclusion. And that's quite right. Outside of our landscape, there is a great swathe of people who are underdocumented or undocumented and unbanked even in this country. And we do need to as a society, get our arms around that issue and do something about it. But the increased focus on financial inclusion is difficult to square with the financial crime focus. So if you look on the one hand, regulators are leaning on firms to get rid of risk on their book, not facilitate money laundering. But on the other hand, they're saying increase financial inclusion, don't offboard people. We need to look at the consumer duty and serve your customers. Look at things like if it's a witting or unwitting mule. And frankly, those two things are really difficult to square against each other. And that's not just in the UK, that's definitely a global concern around anti-money laundering control that's been discussed often over the last decade even. But this continues to be this lack of regulatory coherence for members and beyond about what to do about the financial inclusion, a financial crime landscape, and they're left in this regulatory rock and a hard place. So going forward, I think we really need, as industry and regulators, to come together to find a way through this. I would say, however, sadly, I didn't see much sign of this difficult and thorny issue being grappled with in the FCA's new strategy, which was launched last week. So I think going forward, we're going to continue to face some regulatory incoherence, if I can put that politely, but it's definitely something that needs to be addressed if we're really going to tackle the money muling issue, which I don't for a minute think has dropped. I think it's a kind of reflection of other inhibiting factors in the system.
Can I also add as well, Simon, that CIFAS is working to support members in this regard as well. We've introduced a new simplified filing reason for money muling that's now available. We had a number of different codes that was being used previously, and we've now reduced it down to one. We've also introduced beneficiary fraud check, which will help with banks to talk to each other about potential suspicious transactions. And the FCA paper that talked about the challenges that many banks faced around sharing this data if it didn't meet the standard of proof, that they needed to find an alternative. Well, we've launched the new intelligence service, which is going to give us a lot more flexibility in terms of sharing suspect information, which will obviously include the activities that money mules are involved in as well.
Thank you, Stephen. Always and admirably on message. So thank you so much for that. We've only got time for a few more questions before we need to move to the general Q&A. And there's been an awful lot of detail in this that's been gone through at real pace. There was one figure that I found particularly startling. That's in relation to SIM-swap. Stephen, would you like to say something more about that and that very, very significant figure?
Yeah, it did look really big. We've seen an increase of over 1,000%, but one has to be sort of look at this in a bit more detail. We've gone from a few hundred cases of SIM swaps being reported to over 3,000 a year. Now, I do think this is obviously as a result of changing reporting behaviour by members, but this new number is probably more reflective of the reality of what's going on with SIM swaps. We know that it's becoming a much more significant issue. Action fraud, as I said, have reported a doubling of reports year on year since 2022, and that trend has continued into the end of 2024. SIM swapping is it's a very effective way for fraudsters to hack your phone number, and as a result of getting that access, taking over your banking apps and other accounts. So, the fact that this is increasing and it is an extremely effective way for fraudsters to be able to get to your accounts means that threat will grow.
Fantastic. Look, I think a last question from me, and this to you both, and I'll note at this point that the full report has been shared in the chat, so please all do access that. I'm hoping that many of the people on the call, if not all of them, will be aware of our fraud behaviours work and the results in that pointed to a growing societal willingness to engage in fraudulent acts. I think it was up to 48% either had or thought it was reasonable. Do we see that trend towards a willingness to perpetrate first-party fraud being reflected in the data at all? Who would like first bite at that? Stephen?
Well, I think our data shows that there's a persistent issue with first-party fraud. Over 97,000 of our cases that were filed in 2024 linked to some form of first-party fraud action. And that's an uplift of nearly 3,000 cases on the year before. So I think those figures speak for themselves.
Yeah, if I can add into that, yes. I mean, I think, yes, it's definitely a kind of factor societal. I think we'll all be aware of it, a growing propensity towards dishonesty, which is concerning. And we've seen it reflected in other areas, like huge rise in shoplifting, all sorts of other areas that, we could question as to where that's coming from, societal pressures, atomization of society, who knows? But for me, within these figures, the thing that it's really from Stephen's team's intelligence work that's highlighted this to me since I joined CIFAS. It's how, in this regard, there are two worlds really colliding. I think in the past, we've traditionally seen organised fraud as one thing and first-party fraud as another, and them being mutually exclusive, almost realms. I think what we're starting to see is those two worlds very much colliding, with the organised crime world delivering a sort of crime as a service facility to individual, if I can put it in this way, have-a-go fraudsters, so individuals perpetrating fraud as a sort of lifestyle offence. So the things I'm talking about here are organised crime groups, marketing, if we will, how to evade return and refund controls in online retail, and selling that service onwards to individuals who are then choosing to have a kind of lifestyle funded by fraudulent activity of the first party nature. So I don't think it's the case anymore that we can say this is one thing and that's another. I think those worlds are colliding, facilitated by, of course, the online realm and the ease with which people can market to individuals. And it kind of turns on its head the way we should try and react to this type of crime. I think in the past it's been very much a focus on perpetrators. I think we now need to, yes, do more against first-party fraud, particularly lifestyle offenders. But also, we need to tackle those key facilitators, which are in many ways enabled by the online realm, but tackle some of the underlying crimes as a service facilities that we're seeing sort of proliferate in this space and in others as part of that future fraud strategy, which I will be living, breathing, and dreaming about for the next 6 months, I suspect.
Helena, thank you so much for that comprehensive and very full response. We'll go to Q&A shortly, and there's still minutes for you to put your questions in. I think it's worth just saying on this, we're increasingly aware, aren't we, of anecdotal evidence that points to the Robin Hood effect in relation to first-party fraud, with people and individuals being willing to perpetrate fraud against large companies that they see as somehow being avaricious or impacting their life negatively, but absolutely not perpetrating that fraud against smaller local companies who they see as the good guys. Some really interesting BBC Vox popping that was done on that, and a really interesting dynamic for us to watch as we go forward. So going to the Q&A, and thank you very much for the questions that we have put in. Steve, I'm going to just first question to you as master of the data. And the question is very simple, but no doubt the answer will be quite complicated. Do you think the increase in fraud is related to or attributable to better reporting, or is it actually generally reflecting a much greater rise in fraud, potentially witnessed and seen elsewhere?
I think that it's a mixture, actually. It's a difficult one to be absolutely specific, because obviously we have to take the cases that we see being filed at face value. I think there has been an increase in reporting. Certainly that's reflected in facility takeover with telcos. We've been working really hard with those guys on the issue of this handset acquisition that's being fueled by facility takeover. And that has led to an increase in reporting, which is helping to sort of better understand that threat and also help us look at how we can try and disrupt it. But in addition to that, I think the wider surveys, the Crime Survey of England and Wales, the reports going into action fraud, there's a consistency now that suggests that there was a drop off, but it's now roaring back, and we're getting back to sort of pre-COVID levels in terms of the numbers of frauds that we're seeing.
Helena, this is something you have a view on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could see, obviously, we're only one reflection of what's going on in the system, and like other kind of measures that are based on reporting, an imperfect one, the one I point to in money laundering is the SARS data, just it tracks up. It might mean you're better at detecting it. It might be a measure that people's controls are getting better, so they're able to find this stuff more. So it's imperfect. But if we look across the landscape, as Stephen states, other data points, which are all also tracking up and are also, and actually are not reporting based, I don't think we are seeing the drop in fraud that we saw last year. I think we're starting to track back up. And again, we're hearing that talked about in policy circles. There was a great hurrah last year when we saw the reported 10% drop in fraud, but I don't think there'll be much to celebrate this year. I think that's going to change and shift and react to any changes in the system. So sadly, I think this is a reflection of wider growth, not only in the UK, but globally.
It was interesting, actually. The National Assessment Centre recently published their strategic assessment on the year, and within the fraud category, we've often talked about 40% of all crime is fraud. That's actually gone up to 41% now.
I've got a linked question, which I'm going to answer in part as I go through this. It's interesting, Stephen, that you mentioned action fraud earlier, and as the government gears up to relaunch its fraud reporting service, the question is this: do you think consumers are better informed about how to respond to fraud today than in previous years? And is that one of the causes in the increase that we are seeing more generally, noting, of course, that the filings to the NFD and filings to the Insider Threat Database come from businesses, not from consumers. Stephen, do you want to have first punt of that? And as you consider it, can I ask you, when I go to Helena, to have a look in the Q&A, and there's a technical question about the basis of filings for the NFD, and from Shareem, which if you could answer afterwards, I'd be very grateful. But firstly, consumer reporting, are they better informed?
Well, the government's made great play on Stop Think Fraud, and I think My personal, I mean, it's a difficult one when you're working in this world, and it is always, it's all we're thinking about in terms of that's our day job, is to think about fraud and how we can tackle it. We're fully conversant with what's going on, so looking at what the general public think, and how informed they are is a bit more of a challenge. But I do think there is a greater perception of scams, of the phishing attacks, of the text messages. I think that there has been some success in that regard, and I think that is probably reflected in some of the reporting that is now being made to action fraud. It's worth noting as well, though, that again, the National Assessment Centre in their strategic assessments believe that there is still significant underreporting of fraud. They estimate that only 14%, I'm not quite sure how they arrive at that number, but only 14% of fraud is being reported. And that's partly down to the poor perception of action fraud in the past, which hopefully will be remedied when the new service is launched later in the year.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Helena.
Well, I definitely think people are better informed about fraud, but sadly, I think that's due to the growing scale of fraud. I mean, anyone you ask, I have my kind of personal school run test about what's going on, to test what's going on in the world. And whenever I mention what I do for a living, everyone has either been a victim or knows a victim of fraud. And if I'd, applied that same test 5 years ago, I'm not sure that would have been quite the case. And I think people are better informed because they know somebody who's been a victim, whether it's a parent, a friend, a work colleague. So sadly, I think public awareness is a facet of how big, 41% of all crime. If you add in cyber to that, it's 50% of all crime. It's a shocking statistic. But the responses failed to keep up. I would add in on the consumer side. I mean, there's always been a big focus on consumer awareness and consumer communications, and yes, absolutely, we should do that. But they're going to have increasingly limited effect in I'm going to say it again, AI-driven world, where it's going to be near impossible for anyone to spot this stuff. It's going to be even more sophisticated. Social engineering, driven by greater use of AI, is going to be next level. So I don't think we should be relying on consumers to protect themselves. I think that's unfair in the current landscape.
And with that, I think very wise and urgent words to end on, we are at an end in today's session. Shane, just so you know, Stephen is busy typing a response to your questions, so that will be with you shortly. My thanks to what is and only be described as an expert panel, to Stephen Dalton, our Director of Intelligence, and Helena Wood, our Director of Public Policy here at CIFAS. Thank you all for attending. I hope you found the session useful. The report has been shared. It is available on our website. We're very happy to take any questions in by writing as well. I think, as Mike said right at the beginning, the headline figures are really quite grim, but that points to the scale of the challenge, and it's a challenge though that we are rising to, and there is hope in the extent to which all of us here on this call are coming together to find solutions, to take the argument to government, to take the argument to other policymakers, to deliver real change. Hopefully, when we meet either in 6 months' time for the update or in a year's time for Fraudscape 2026, we'll be able to report on better news. In the meantime, good luck with a good fight. Thank you for your time, and I wish you a very good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.